Writers, it's so important to be able to skip time well, because if you don't, you might confuse the reader and they might just get bewildered and stop reading your book, or they might just get bored because you're including stuff that you really should be skipping over, but you're including in your book. So we're gonna go over 5 strategies that you can use when skipping time in your novel. Number 3 is probably my favorite, and number 5 is probably the most dangerous one. But let's start with number 1. Number 1 is using date headers. Basically, you have a chapter break or a section break, and then you pick it up months or years later, and you signal that by a header saying, oh, 4 years later, or 2 months later, or whatever it is. Now we're gonna start with a very extreme example. This one is from Neil Stephenson's 7 Eves. So there's a part in this book, and you can see it's about 2/3 of the way through the story, where you're just, reading along, everything's normal, and then you turn the page, and then you see this, 5,000 years later. Are you kidding me? I mean, really, Neil? Now, unless you're writing in certain genres, you probably are not going to have a 5,000 year time jump. But I do think the way he does it is extremely clear. Like, you're oriented right away. Okay, I guess this is 5,000 years later in the story. Now let's look at a slightly more commonplace example. This one is from Normal People by Sally Rooney. And all of her chapters in this book are actually date headers. So here we see 3 months later, and then she gives the date of July 2012. Now, what's the advantage of a strategy like this? Well, for one, it is very clear, right? There's no missing. Oh, I know exactly in what time we are and how much time has elapsed. It's very unambiguous, and it lets the reader know right away where we are in time. But here's a general rule of how to do this well. The general principle is the longer the time break, the bigger the divide you have to make. So if you have a time break of like a day, well, you just need a section break from that, like 3 asterisks, right? You don't even need to have a chapter break. However, if you have a break of say a week or a month or something like that, usually that's big enough where you need to transition into a full-on chapter break. Now, what if you skip a lot of time, like a Neil Stephenson amount of time? Or let's say you're just writing like a family saga and you're skipping 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Okay, then you need a part break. So this is bigger than a chapter break, and it's just like part 2 or part 3. And inside that part, you're gonna have a whole bunch of different chapters before you move on to the next part. Okay, so let's move on to the second great way to skip time in your novel: time markers in the text. This is James Runsey's The Great Passion, and it is a historical novel about the life of Bach. In the first chapter, he is 37 years old and Bach has just died. But then when we get to the second chapter, we see this. It was the week after Easter in 1726, and it goes on from there. So what Runsey's doing is expressing very clearly, okay, you know the time of year, it's the week after Easter, which is important because the whole novel is going toward the next Easter. And then 2, you know the year. So we know that we've skipped back in time and now he's a kid now and no longer an adult. And this tells the story of when he's going to meet Bach for the first time. Or for another example of time markers actually in the text, check out The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. Now, what's fun about this is that it's a graphic novel. I don't highlight a lot of graphic novels in this channel, but I don't know, maybe I should, you tell me. And what's happening here is there is a child in Iran and she is narrating her experience of the Iran-Iraq war. And there's a chapter break, and then the next section starts. The war had been going on for 2 years. We were used to it. So this one doesn't have a date, but it lets you know where in time you are by reference to the big thing that's going on, the war. Now, my piece of advice with this is don't be afraid to be obvious. Some people, when they're writing, they're like, ooh, like, I don't want to come out and just like say what I'm trying to say. Time markers are really a case when you should be as blatantly obvious as possible. This is your chance. Just say when it is so the reader knows. Now, some of you might ask, okay, can I like wait for a paragraph to mention like what time it is and have like an intro paragraph and then talk about it? I think that in general, this is usually a bad idea to do, because however long you wait, the reader is going to be confused about when this story is taking place until you tell them when it's taking place. Do you want to leave the reader confused for a paragraph? I mean, If you do, then try it out. But 90% of the time, I think it's usually best to just start with that first sentence saying, here's where you are in time, dear reader. Dear reader, like I'm some sort of, I don't know, uncle reading to the nephews or something. But if you want an example of an exception, I'll actually show you one where the time marker doesn't come until the second sentence. And this is by Alice Munro, The Progress of Love. And I actually don't have a copy of that book, so I'm gonna read the excerpt from this book, which is about how to use time in fiction. It's from Grey Wolf Press. It's absolutely fantastic if you want to check it out, but let me read that excerpt. I got a call at work and it was my father. This was not long after I was divorced and started in the real estate office. So what is she doing here? The very first sentence is the inciting incident. Oh, I got this phone call from my father, and we're wondering, okay, what's gonna happen? And then she steps back a second and says, okay, here's where I am in time. Here's what's going on in this situation. I was recently divorced. I had recently started in a real estate office. But as a general principle, the longer you go without telling the reader where in time they are, the more confused they will be. Now, I know that some of you might be really angry with me right now because I just used an Alice Munro example. If you guys don't know the recent controversy, Alice Munro recently died, and it came out after her death that her daughter was abused by her husband and she had kept this a secret. So understandably, a lot of people struggle to read her in the same way. She's been cut from a lot of syllabi and really her whole legacy is in question. So I guess why am I using her as an example in this video? I think it's because my general principle is I want to divide the work from the person. You don't have to be a good person for us to learn from your writing. You don't have to be a good person for me to even enjoy your books. And so what I'm trying to do in all these videos is try to teach you the best way to write, even if the author happened to be a morally dubious person. However, if you can't get past the fact of what she did in her personal life, then I mean, I completely understand that. Like, I get that. However, if it's really necessary, like if I am talking about time, Alice Munro is really a master of handling time in fiction. So I felt like I needed to include her in this video, but I also needed to explain, like, I'm not ignoring or excusing the fact of what she did. Okay, onward, enough of that. Let's move on to 3 situational clues. Let's look at Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, in the first 5 chapters of this book, we have this pandemic that's spreading across the entire world. And actually, yes, this did come out before COVID, but there's a massive time skip between chapter 5 and chapter 6. Now, how does she handle it? I'll tell you what she doesn't do. She does not have a chapter heading with the time. As you can see here, it just says 6. And she also doesn't use time markers in the text. She doesn't say 20 years later, blah, blah, blah. Instead, she gives us these situational clues to let us know, oh, hey, a huge portion of time has passed since the previous chapter. And the way she does this is through a list of what we no longer have in this post-pandemic world. No more chlorinated pools, no more baseball games, no more porch lights, no more trains. So those are sort of small things, and then she works her way up to larger things. No more flights, no more countries, and no more borders, no more fire departments, no more police. I think this is both very clear and more subtle than our first 2 strategies as a way of telling the reader, oh hey, guess what? A lot of time has passed. So in your novel, I want you to think about places where you can skip through time really fluidly by just giving situational clues. And I'm gonna give you a couple of examples of that. For instance, let's say you have your characters going on a trip. The end of one chapter can be them deciding to go on a trip, and the beginning of the next chapter could be them arriving. And what you just skipped is all the boring travel parts in the middle, if they are boring, right? If something actually happened during the travel, then okay, fine, include that. But if nothing exciting happened, just skip right to the arrival and the reader will sense the amount of time that has passed. Another great example would be a pregnancy. Say the end of one chapter is a character discovering they are pregnant. The beginning of the very next chapter can be them actually having the baby. Now you know exactly how much time has passed without explicitly saying it. Another example, let's say at the end of one chapter, a character gets a wound, and in the beginning of the next chapter, you mention that wound is now healed. We get a sense of the weeks that must have elapsed for that wound to heal. You don't need to say, 3 weeks later, da da da. Now, the absolutely crucial part in this whole idea of skipping time in your fiction is knowing what parts to skip, right? If you don't know that, then I mean, you're sunk. These techniques won't help you at all. And I mean, the general principle is so easy to understand, it almost seems dumb for me to say, but I'm gonna say it anyway. You want to slow down time and focus on the most exciting parts, and anything that's boring, you skip it. So what that means is if you're coming to a part in your fiction and you're like, man, this scene just isn't working, I'm trying to write it and it just feels boring when I write it and it feels boring when I read it, that might be a good sign that maybe you should skip that whole scene entirely and find a way to start up the story once that scene is done. All right, let's get to our fourth strategy of how to skip over time in your fiction, and it is use summary. So when you use summary, basically what you do is you take a couple sentences or maybe a paragraph and you just show the passing of time. And what you're doing is you're compressing, say, a couple weeks or a couple months or a couple seasons, and you're just compressing it inside a single paragraph. And for an example of this, we're gonna go back to an old childhood favorite of mine, Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Specifically, the Fellowship of the Ring, the first one in the trilogy. And this is after Gandalf has told Frodo of the history of the ring, and then Gandalf disappears for a bit. So he basically talks about the Shire having a really fair summer, a wonderful autumn, trees laden with apples, honey dripping in the combs, corn tall and full. I mean, you just get the sense of, oh, here's time passing. Autumn was well underway before Frodo began to worry about Gandalf again. September was passing and there was still no news of him. So in a mere, say, 3 sentences, we've just moved through a good 4 or 5 months and done so really easily. So the question is, why would you do it this way? Why not just omit this part of the story entirely and then start up again when, I don't know, there's action happening, like you would with date headers or the situational way? And I think this is really a question of style. What this does is it gives your book a sort of easygoing flow to it. It feels very gentle. There are no sharp ruptures or sharp breaks. It feels like a river of narrative. And if that's the feeling that you're going for, then maybe this is the right strategy for you. But I'd also like to say that you can use this strategy not just for long periods of time, but you can also use it for shorter periods of time. This is a Margaret Atwood novel, Oryx and Crake, and we have a section where there's actually just a very, very short skip of time at the beginning of a chapter. He'd waited for her, at first with impatience, then with anxiety, then panic. It shouldn't take them that long to make a couple of pizzas. So what amount of time is being skipped over here? Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes? And the reason why she includes this is we're feeling his anxiety, like, okay, something's going wrong. They're not coming back. So at any point in your story, if you're trying to write a scene and it feels boring to you, transition, try to write it as summary, try to speed up that time, cover that time in say 2 or 3 sentences, and you might find it works much, much better to get the reader back to the more exciting parts. Okay, now it's time for our final strategy for how to skip time. It is number 5, don't mention the time jump at all. So I mentioned at the beginning that I thought this was the most dangerous of all the techniques, and that's because the danger is that you're gonna confuse the reader. Now, the difference between this and number 3, the situational way, is I think this is much less direct. It's a lot more subtle. You don't even try to really give a bunch of clues that a bunch of time has passed. Now, why would you do this? I don't know, maybe you're writing a more experimental book, which is trying to say something about the nature of time itself. Or maybe you're writing a time travel book and your point is that time doesn't really matter. I don't know what it could be, but you could have ulterior reasons for not orienting the reader. And then also there are some books that don't require time jumps at all. I think of pretty lengthy books that take place entirely in one day. Books like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, The Hours by Michael Cunningham, or Ulysses by James Joyce. Now I include this last strategy of like really not trying to orient the reader to the time jumps, just as a way to let you know, like, yeah, you can break rules. It's okay to break rules. So the first 4 things I taught you are very definite ways to skip time. But if you don't want to follow any of those, okay, take a stab at writing something a little more experimental and try to confuse the reader a little bit. Then your book becomes a type of puzzle where part of the puzzle is figuring out, all right, what time is this? How are we shifting through time? Are we back in time? Are we forward in time? Forcing the reader to kind of be a detective and deduce what time they're in is a perfectly fine way of writing a book if that's the type of book you're trying to write. Okay, I hope that helped you. Please click that like button, please hit that subscribe, and good luck with skipping time in your books.